Dawn crept across the Norman hedgerows with a low mechanical growl of engines warming in the mist. Steel tracks bit into damp earth as American Sherman tanks idled nose to nose, crews hunched inside cramped turrets, fingers resting near triggers worn smooth by weeks of combat. Radios hissed with static and half-finished orders. Somewhere beyond the bocage, German 88mm guns waited in silence. This was the moment George S. Patton believed had arrived, the moment to break the German line completely, to punch through with armor and never look back. Patton's demand was simple in language, but enormous in consequence. Unleash the armored divisions, bypass resistance, drive deep, and collapse the enemy's rear before they could recover. To Patton, hesitation was defeat, speed was salvation. Every hour lost meant the Germans digging in deeper, repositioning their Panthers and Tigers, repairing rail lines, and stabilizing a front that had nearly shattered after the Normandy landings. But hundreds of miles away, Dwight D. Eisenhower studied a different battlefield, one drawn not only in ink and symbols, but in fuel tonnage, port capacity, infantry exhaustion, and fragile alliances. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower was fighting not with one army or even one nation's forces. He was balancing British caution, American aggression, French political pressure, and a logistics system stretched to its absolute limit. The cause of the conflict between Eisenhower and Patton lay not in personality alone, but in doctrine. Patton believed armored warfare was a blade, sharp, fast, decisive. Eisenhower believed it was part of a machine, and a machine could tear itself apart if pushed beyond its limits. Every tank that surged forward needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and infantry to secure its flanks. Without those, even the fastest breakthrough could turn into encirclement and destruction. German commanders understood this vulnerability. Though battered, they still possessed disciplined panzer divisions, heavy anti-tank guns, and interior lines of communication. They no longer needed to win outright. They only needed to delay, bleed, and disrupt. Every destroyed bridge, every ambushed supply convoy, every immobilized Sherman became a weapon against Allied momentum. As Patton pressed his case, Eisenhower listened, but he did not yield. What he saw was not just the promise of victory, but the shadow of catastrophic overreach. And in that tension between speed and control, the future of the Allied campaign in Western Europe hung in the balance. Eisenhower's decision-making under pressure was shaped by memory as much as intelligence. He remembered the German blitzkrieg of 1940, not just its speed, but how it succeeded because French forces were fragmented, uncoordinated, and logistically paralyzed. Eisenhower refused to allow the Allies to repeat that mistake in reverse. A breakthrough that outran its infantry and artillery was not a victory. It was an invitation to disaster. Patton's Third Army was indeed performing brilliantly. Using M4 Shermans, half-tracks, and aggressive reconnaissance, his units exploited gaps with textbook precision. Tank destroyer battalions leapfrogged forward, engineers threw bridges across rivers under fire, and forward air controllers called in fighter bombers to suppress German strongpoints. The effect was intoxicating. German units collapsed faster than expected. Prisoners poured in, and maps filled with arrows pointing east. But Eisenhower saw the hidden cost. Fuel depots ran dry faster than planners had calculated. Red Ball Express truck columns stretched endlessly along shattered French roads, vulnerable to Luftwaffe raids and mechanical failure. Infantry divisions lagged behind the armor, forced to clear bypassed towns where German units still fought from cellars and church towers. Every mile gained by tanks alone created a longer, thinner supply line. Meanwhile, German commanders adapted. Unable to stop the Allied advance head-on, they shifted to elastic defense. Panthers concealed in tree lines ambushed Shermans whose 75 mm guns struggling against sloped armor. Nebelwerfer rocket batteries saturated crossroads with terror-inducing barrages. Small Kampfgruppen slipped behind Allied spearheads to destroy fuel trucks and sever communications. The effect of Eisenhower's restraint became clearer with each passing day. Instead of allowing Patton to surge unchecked, Eisenhower redistributed supplies, reinforced Montgomery's front, and insisted on coordinated pressure across the entire line. It was not dramatic, it was methodical, and it denied the Germans the one thing they needed most: time to rebuild a coherent defensive front against a single reckless thrust. To soldiers on the ground, the decision felt distant and often infuriating. Tank crews waited for fuel that did not arrive. Infantry paid the price of clearing ground inch by inch. Casualties mounted. Yet those sacrifices preserved cohesion. Units supported one another. Artillery remained within range. Air cover stayed continuous. Eisenhower absorbed Patton's anger in silence, knowing that leadership sometimes meant disappointing your most aggressive commanders to save the army as a whole. As the campaign pushed eastward, the true test of Eisenhower's approach emerged in the grinding battles that followed. This was no longer a war of open fields and sudden collapse. It became a contest of endurance, coordination, and adaptation. Combined arms doctrine, tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air power working as one, proved decisive where speed alone failed. Sherman crews learned to fight smarter rather than faster. Infantry rode tanks into battle, dismounting to flush out anti-tank teams with grenades and rifle fire. Artillery observers advanced with forward units, calling down precise barrages that shattered German counterattacks before they formed. Fighter bombers roared overhead, strafing supply columns and forcing German armor to move only at night. The German response grew increasingly desperate. Heavier tanks like the Tiger II appeared, technically superior in armor and firepower, but mechanically fragile and starved of fuel. Their effect was psychological as much as physical. A single Tiger could dominate a road until Allied coordination isolated it, cut its supply, and destroyed it with artillery or airstrikes. Eisenhower's insistence on balance produced a cumulative effect. German losses mounted not just in tanks destroyed, but in experienced crews killed or captured. Replacements lacked training. Coordination broke down. Orders arrived too late. Every failed counterattack consumed irreplaceable resources. Patton, constrained but not silenced, adapted. He focused on operational flexibility rather than reckless depth. When openings appeared, he exploited them, but within a framework that ensured support followed. The result was slower than his ideal, but far more lethal over time. The human cost remained severe. Crews burned alive in steel coffins. Infantry advanced under mortar fire that tore men apart without warning. Medics worked endlessly, often under fire, to save lives that could never be fully restored. Eisenhower read casualty reports daily, aware that every strategic decision translated directly into blood. Yet those sacrifices achieved something speed alone could not. They preserved combat power. They prevented catastrophic encirclement. They ensured that when the final breakthroughs came, they would not collapse under their own weight. By the time Allied forces approached Germany's borders, the effects of Eisenhower's refusal to grant Patton an immediate, unlimited breakthrough were undeniable. The Wehrmacht was no longer a cohesive force capable of strategic maneuver. It had become a collection of exhausted units reacting rather than shaping events. German attempts at armored counteroffensives faltered under relentless Allied pressure. Without sufficient fuel, coordination, or air cover, even elite panzer divisions were reduced to static defense. Allied logistics, once fragile, now flowed steadily through captured ports and repaired rail lines. The machine Eisenhower had protected was finally operating at full strength. Leadership under pressure revealed its true nature in these moments. Patton remained aggressive, brilliant, and demanding, but now within a system that multiplied his effectiveness rather than risking its destruction. Montgomery's deliberate advances fixed German forces in place. Eisenhower's headquarters synchronized movements across hundreds of miles of front. The cause and effect chain was clear. By denying an early, uncontrolled breakthrough, Eisenhower forced the Germans to fight everywhere at once. They could not mass armor effectively. They could not rebuild reserves. Every defensive success cost them something they could not replace. Inferior equipment, when properly coordinated, proved decisive. The Sherman, often criticized for its thin armor, survived because it rarely fought alone. Doctrine compensated for design limits. Training compensated for technological gaps. Coordination turned adequacy into superiority. Soldiers felt the difference. They advanced knowing artillery was behind them, air cover above them, and logistics feeding them. Fear remained, but chaos diminished. Survival improved. Confidence grew. Eisenhower's decision was never about denying glory. It was about ensuring victory endured beyond the next map line. And as the German front finally cracked beyond repair, it became clear that restraint, not recklessness, had shaped the outcome. When the war in Europe finally collapsed, it did so not with a single dramatic armored thrust, but with systemic failure across every German front. The Wehrmacht ran out of fuel, ammunition, trained crews, and time. Allied forces advanced not as isolated spearheads, but as a synchronized force impossible to stop. Patton would later argue that greater freedom earlier might have shortened the war, perhaps. But Eisenhower understood a deeper truth of command. Wars are not won by boldness alone, but by decisions that survive friction, resistance, and human cost. The soldiers who crossed the Rhine did so in units that still functioned, still communicated, still trusted their support. They were exhausted, scarred, and changed, but not broken. That endurance was the product of leadership that valued cohesion over spectacle. Eisenhower's greatest action was not a single order or maneuver. It was the discipline to say no under immense pressure, to absorb criticism, to accept slower progress in exchange for irreversible momentum. His decision shaped not just the pace of victory, but its sustainability. In armored warfare, steel and firepower dominate the eye, but beneath them lie doctrine, logistics, and leadership. When Patton demanded an immediate breakthrough, Eisenhower chose a harder path, one that demanded patience, coordination, and sacrifice. And in doing so, he ensured that when the breakthrough finally came, nothing could stop it.